Welcome to another edition of Underground Strategy. And today we're honored to be joined by Ben Zweibelson, a seasoned soldier and theorist and a leading voice in how we could possibly reevaluate our understanding of conflict. His new book, Reconceptualizing War, challenges traditional military thinking and offers a bold new framework and will explore his ideas and influences and what it means to think differently about war in the modern world. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Tony, thank you for having me. It's been a great honor.
So what first inspired you to challenge traditional thinking, at least in the military context, and then exploring new ways to conceptualize war?
You know, that's a really fun question, and we can dive really deep. I think it's part of my personality. And I think a lot of authors and writers that are out there that are challenging and doing things as they're essentially artists. And you're asking me, what was your artist inspiration? What's your spirit animal? I've got to go way back to a memorable event for me in third grade. And this is when I really became an artist. And I was that art kid in school. I was the one that was always drawing and doing art. But in third grade, we were doing some sort of paper mache project. And I had this idea that I was going to make a dragon's mouth that was going to be, the whole head was going to be coming out, 3D. And the art teacher was instructing us to do everything very flat. And so all the kids around me were following the instructions and they were doing it flat. And I was just like, nope, I'm doing it this way. I have my idea. And I literally remember fellow kids looking at me going like, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Stop. And there's this contrarian element in me that was just like, no, shut up. I know what I'm doing. And I just kept going and going. And the art teacher, of course, smart, sees the kid that's kind of doing things a little differently. She encouraged me. And when I was done, when I was, closer to production of the final piece and painting it, then all the kids saw it and they're like, wow, and some of them wanted to restart and like make one like mine. And then, as little kids, you're marched through the hallway, single file. This is back in the 1980s. And, they put our artwork up on the wall. And I remember being so proud, walking to lunch, and I'm in my line, and all these other kids are like, wow, like pointing at my paper mache dragon head. And that's where I sort of kind of knew or learned who I was. I'm someone that wants to challenge the system, and that gets me in trouble a lot. It got me in trouble in my military career. It gets me in trouble all the time. It's who I am. And that's really what led to me going through 20 years of the military. And along the way, I kept saying, like, I understand why we do the tactics, but why are we doing everything else this way? And why do we say these things? And why do we believe it this way? And are there other alternatives? And a lot of the times the military is very, very conventional and very convergent and conservative. And it's like, no, shut up and color. And it brings me right back to that third grade event. And I'm just still that little third grader going like, I got a better idea. And ultimately that's what led to this. The 742 pages of me making a paper mache dragon against everyone's wishes.
And for our listeners, Ben was just lifting up his book over there. It's an absolute tome. I've managed to get through about 150 pages of it in preparation for today. So I've got a few more to get to that 740. Do you sometimes miss the military, though? You mentioned your 20 years of service. Is there anything that you reflect back on when you think about that and how you think about war now?
The interesting thing about military service for most that spend some time is that there's an esprit de corps. There's a camaraderie of suffering, and that suffering builds these bonds that these human beings then carry throughout the rest of their life. But a lot of times when they go back into a civilian world or society, they break from the uniform, they're often struggling with how to manifest or experience some of these bonds and these deep feelings, and they're just not getting it because I think the circumstances and the chaos and the danger and the mutual suffering in conflict and war, and that's a very, very unique context you're not going to find except for other dangerous professions, firefighters, emergency responders, law enforcement. And this also, I think, leads to a lot of emotional and mental health issues for veterans of war. And that's something that is systemic across, everywhere. Me personally, I've been lucky in that when I retired almost 10 years ago, after 22 years of combined service, I had a great opportunity as I was entering my PhD program to study and do this kind of design, philosophy, different stuff. I got a job offer to work on these types of things with the U.S. Special Operations Command, or SOCOM. And I moved my family to Florida and set up shop at the Joint Special Operations University. And I got to spend about almost 7 years doing this and at the same time kind of enriching and developing myself to do the doctorate and then still working with uniformed professionals. And now I'm a government civilian. I work at a very high strategic level in the DoD for a combatant command, and that's also very rewarding. So I'm still in the presence of that military environment, and so I'm maybe not as stressed or vulnerable as a lot of folks that just when they hang up the uniform, they're out. And I think that's a challenge, right? That's a challenge for a lot of folks that have gone through the trials and tribulations of combat.
Yeah, I think when you leave, you lose the surrogate family, you lose your brothers. And I know Max and I talk about it often. You kind of have to redefine your identity a little bit. You got to think about who you are in this world.
You do. There's a belonging, there's identity, and there's purpose. And we all human beings want purpose, right? And we also all want some sort of identity. I will say that virtually all male military veterans, the first thing they do when they retire is grow a beard. I am guilty of that as well. And mostly that's because you spent 20 years where you were told you had to shave every day. So these are little things that we do. I think that some of the healthy things that a lot of veterans do is they look for other veterans and support networks. And there's a lot of opportunities, not just the United States, but in a lot of the NATO countries that have a lot of military veterans. There's these programs and there's these communities that help these veterans with their problems. And the biggest challenge is just getting somebody who needs help to first admit it to themselves. That's the biggest barrier. And frankly, military people are stubborn. They're often fiercely self-sufficient and they want to be independent. So that's the biggest hurdle. And unfortunately for some, it's an insurmountable hurdle, which is part of why I dedicate this book to my brothers and sisters in combat, especially those that either lost their lives or gave up their lives in combat, and for many that carried demons home and they weren't able to overcome them.
It's a very honorable cause, and I did read that dedication. It was very poetic. And I think when you talk about, the idea of, coming out of service, for many veterans, there is this kind of thing where there's this gap and, people don't know what I've done for them. Society's not grateful. And often that's maybe too harsh for me to put in those terms, but there's probably a lot of feelings to be unpacked. And what I find in conversations with veterans, what helps is reflecting on things, right? And writing them down, whether it's you're going to publish them or just in your own diary. And many go on to write memoirs, Max being one of them, who has a tremendous, honestly, 10 years of service, in war zones. But you've taken it a step further where you certainly obviously are reflecting on your service, but you're looking at war as a philosophical construct. You're looking at as the phenomenon of war, as a societal change. And how did you find yourself coming to this project, to this realization? How did you find yourself dealing with, I know you gave us the roots from, being a bit of an iconoclast, bit of an artist, but now taking on this big subject after so many years, could you give us a line?
Sure. I think a lot of us we have kind of that core or that cornerstone of who we are, our identity. And I think that also kind of drives what we think our purpose is in life, even if our purposes change over time as we grow. Some people have more of this kind of engineering, methodical identity. And I work with these people all the time. I love them because there's a certain way, an engineering mindset. And there's probably a lot of listeners who are like, yeah, that's me. Right. And then there's other people that are more freeform and more of these kind of artists. Right. And some of these people are borderline unemployable if they're too creative. I fall into maybe that category a little bit more, which explains sometimes why I get myself in trouble, and I have in the past. Not by misbehaving, by being bad or, making poor decisions, but by asking why and by challenging the institution. And if you do that, no matter where you are, you're going to provoke the institutional defenses. They will stand up because all of civilization is based upon several, I think, very basic constructs that we all can see, no matter what your belief system is. Each belief system, each paradigm, if you will, social paradigm, it operates to sustain itself. And the only way it can sustain itself is it has to have living, breathing humans that subscribe and endorse and operate and maintain said paradigm. Because if you don't, you have a dead paradigm, just like you have, say, a dead religion or a dead language. If you run out of living, breathing believers, it's over. And we have many examples in history where we can't decipher the language or the pictographs because there's nobody there to translate it. I think that social paradigms have to have an extension of what we view as conflict and organized violence or war. And this is why I wrote this book, because I grew up professionally in the United States Army, and I experienced war with NATO, with allies, with our coalition, with partners. And war was waged against a variety of adversaries in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many of those adversaries, of course, were unconventional or irregular, but others were traditional nation states. Every Katyusha rocket fragment that I saw after it blew up and almost killed us or killed people around us, there were Iranian tail numbers on them, right? So it's always a reminder that, well, we know the nation states that are involved in these conflicts and the ones that are influencing and the ones that are in that orbit using surrogates and proxies. However, I wanted over time, as I developed my education in military decision-making, and as a philosopher, I just kept questioning why. I ran out of runway, if you will, because a lot of the schools I went to would say, well, at a certain point, there's a breaking point, and it's either doctrine or the cherished theorists of said war paradigm. And that's where you better stop saying why. I broke past that, which probably got me in trouble, but that's sort of where I end up with this book, is that I really go into, for the Western functionalists, the limits, the ultimate frame and limits of, say, Clausewitz, of Jomini, of Mahan, of Corbett, all these different great thinkers that have influenced the modern military profession today. But then I also pivot over to Marx, to Mao, to different belief systems that are quite contrary to ancient Chinese war philosophy, and then into ideological beliefs that underpin certain, if you want to say, doomsday groups or movements that are trying to bring about some sort of Armageddon through war that is ideologically structured, right? And then into eco-terrorism, and into social Marxism, into all these different constructs that each war paradigm, the operators and practitioners, they ultimately come to a final answer, which is it must fit under our frame. Our frame is the best frame. We will interpret this as such. And that frustrated me. I had one quick example in Afghanistan. It was 2011. And I was an operational strategic planner in Kabul. And I was working with a senior leader who was actually a well-established military theorist who was an expert on Clausewitz and centers of gravity. And we had, under his guidance, because he told me, Ben, we're going to do centers of gravity, even though you don't like them. And I said, yes, sir. But we still broke from what the ISAF, the higher headquarters, had said the strategic enemy center of gravity was for the adversary. And we wrote a different one. And when that whole document, that strategic document, went up to the ISAF headquarters, they said, hey, this is great. We're going to send this out to all the embassies. Everyone's going to get to see it. But our intel folks and our campaign planners are upset that you didn't cite this center of gravity, the correct one. And I said, well, we came up with a different one because we think you're wrong. And we think it's this. And this senior leader at that higher level said, I don't care what you think, and I don't care what the Taliban think. We know what their center of gravity is, and we are right. And that is what is going to be in here in this document, and yours will match. And they deleted that section, rewrote it themselves, and then published it. And I remember that because it's like, that's it right there, that obedience to your frame despite everything.
Enjoying the episode? Leave a review wherever you listen. YouTube, hit subscribe to keep us going. Let's carry on.
I mean, this is a case in point, but you mentioned this idea of cultures, right? Initially, I was thinking cultures between countries, between peoples from different areas, but now also I'm thinking the internal cultures, like this culture of, as you mentioned there, I must be right at all costs. We are hierarchical, God-fearing military, and therefore I am right and I'm the boss. Just out of curiosity, and you don't have to give us details, but how did that play out, before we go into the cultures? Were you guys right? And not that I want to go into right and wrong, but how did it play out? Did you guys have the right center of gravity?
Well, I mean, I personally think centers of gravity don't exist. They exist epistemologically. We imagine they're there just like we imagine there's levels of war. And this is a useful framework for the functionalist war paradigm. And I understand that's why we do it. At the same time, we apply what is really a pseudoscientific methodology that we fool ourselves into saying it's more objective and scientific than it actually is. But that's a whole internal cultural issue of functionalists, and I go into that in great detail in the book. So in that case, it was just a power play. The higher headquarters was right because they were above us, and that was the strategic narrative that went out. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And of course, 2020 hindsight, who's running Afghanistan today? Not us or the people that we were trying to prop up. That's a whole other issue. But philosophically, first of all, this book is a book on war philosophy, because I feel if we are going to reconceptualize war, we first have to conceptualize it. And that's what I do, is I conceptualize what the war paradigm is for all major actors in modern society today, across the board. And we mentioned this, Marxists and Western industrialists and social Marxists and all these different variations and ideological extremists, right? We conceptualize how they say war is. In order to do that, you have to start at philosophical, because the bullets and bombs and the violence that's done at the tactical level, you can't really you can argue tactics, of course, but you cannot argue belief systems because it's just not appropriate. You have to start at the philosophical level, which is why this book is the two pillars, the two constructs that drive the organizational logic of this book. The first is social paradigm theory, which Burrell and Morgan and I spend the whole first chapter explaining what they brought in the 1970s, how it works, how it differs from when we hear the word paradigm in most military circles, and as well as academic, we normally think a Kuhnian, or Thomas Kuhn, a scientific paradigm. And I explain in the first chapter, as well as the introduction, why that's not the case. There are scientific paradigms for certain, but that's not what we're talking about here, and that's not what we use in war. Although there are technological scientific paradigm shifts, certainly, but that's not the point. The point is social paradigms are different. The other pillar that underpins this book is Anatole Rappaport, who was a very important, influential games theorist, philosopher, philosophy of conflict. He even did an introduction to Clausewitz's On War, the 1968 Penguin paperback version, which is generally despised by most pure hardcore Clausewitzians, not because the paperback itself is an abridged version that misses large chunks of it, but because Rappaport's introduction was just so out of the ordinary, because he said, this is what Clausewitz does, and here's all this other stuff that he doesn't do. And that's what angers the institutionalists. And so they'll say, well, don't read that version. You got to read this version instead. And of course, when everyone tells me not to read something, I immediately buy it on Amazon.
Totally. And I think there's a tradition of that. We mentioned earlier just in the prep, Ben, and you brought that point across well. And there's so many strong followers who take it, as you mentioned, as religion. And also others like, John Keegan, who was groundbreaking himself. And he put his foot over that line and criticized Clausewitz and did receive some blowback because of that. I'm wondering, in this book, when you talk about the paradigms and how we understand it, do you find that between cultures that it's hard for us to understand the next culture? You had mentioned the Taliban over there. You referenced China's idea, the book of change. And do you think that on this high strategic level, that understanding these different cultures is critical, despite, the tactics we can learn and we can adapt, etc. But do you think that becomes some sort of block, or is this something that needs re-exploring?
Yes, absolutely. And I think a shining example of this is for most of our listeners, probably a lot of English speakers, probably either academic or military and familiar with, say, American military doctrine, British military doctrine, joint doctrine, Canadian, Australian, all the doctrines for military activities all share a lot of the same language, themes, patterns. And you'll see something like, and I can't remember exactly which American Army doctrine did this, but several are guilty. They'll put cool theorist quotes in there to spice things up and show, hey, we're intellectuals. And you'll see a Karl von Clausewitz quote about war leading off a chapter. And then right underneath it, you'll see a Sun Tzu quote. And they're right there, just next to each other, hanging out. And as my book explains, and I go into this is almost like putting spaghetti with ice cream, right? It's so alien to put these two together. Number one, it illustrates that many of our doctrine writers don't really read the stuff that they put cool quotes in, but it also shows that philosophically we don't understand our own war frame. because, the basis of Sun Tzu, for example, is that all warfare is deception. And Sun Tzu famously said that the poor general fights a battle and loses, a good general fights the battle and wins, and then the great general, the great sage, as they said it, wins the battle without fighting the battle. All right? And that goes into Taoism. There's elements of Confucianism. These are Eastern constructs that date back thousands of years and have shaped this Eastern, non-Western mindset on conflict in a way that's profoundly, philosophically different than the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian West, of which you have the basis of Machiavelli, Vauban, and then later on Jomini and Clausewitz, and then Fuller and Littlehart and Boyd. This is based in a very, very different framework. And, not to split hairs on, Jomini and Clausewitz and who was following what doctrine entering into World War I, because my book does go into that in chapter 3, and we go into great detail. But just broadly, if you're putting Jomini or Clausewitz or Machiavelli and you're throwing it next to Sun Tzu or another Eastern war philosopher, what are you doing? You're mixing things, and that is, again, an indication not only of our frame ignorance, but also our subtle belief that our frame is the only frame that matters. All war theory must subscribe to our frame. And I go into this in great detail with how Marx and Engels, and then later Mao and Giap and others would adopt certain elements of Clausewitz, of which then the Clausewitzian defenders, the advocates of Clausewitz is universally the best, they will say, look, Marx used Clausewitz, Engels used Clausewitz, Mao, Lenin used Clausewitz, so Clausewitz works. And it's like, hold on. They are assimilating certain Clausewitzian concepts into their war paradigm that has profoundly different beliefs. So this isn't really Clausewitz is being used by them. It's Clausewitz is being inverted, twisted, adapted, converted, just as many senior military leaders entering World War I were doing the same thing, adding applications of Jomini, but saying it's Clausewitz, or inverting some of Clausewitz's maxims, whether we talk about his realist or idealist phases. And so the book goes into this in great detail. I don't want to bore the audience, but we simply have paradigm ignorance of our frame and this arrogance, this institutional arrogance that ours is the right way and anything else is inferior or wasting time.
I like what you said about Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, kind of the context, from two different times, really. It's like, did a Diplodocus, as my son would say, live in the same time as a T-Rex? I obviously wouldn't have a clue, but he'd tell me, what do you mean? It's like so many million years apart. And I think you bring this idea not into paleontology, full disclosure. These chapters I did read in more detail. And I liked it because you take us on a journey through it. And when it comes to the First World War, I like the part where you speak about the Schlieffen Plan and you speak about this idea that the whole context has changed into an industrialized setting and, some of these older concepts no longer apply. So for me, in my simple mind, right, I obviously can't think about some of these concepts in the same depth, but it does bring it home that, when you look at it as there's some continuities and there's other things where things have radically changed and war means something new almost.
When World War I is a very important war in terms of just so many things beyond the organized violence, the horror, the technology, the total nation. It's considered the first modern war by many. And in my book, almost all the chapters draw to World War I as foundational to where we are today, particularly the aftermath of World War I, because of what happened to the traditional or classic Marxists when they looked at, you didn't have your proletariat overthrowing the state system and throwing off the shackles of capitalism in Berlin or London or Paris, even though those were the areas under the greatest of strain, right? It happened in backwards Russia. And this is wrong. This isn't what Marx and Engels forecasted. And what does this mean? So there's that. And then there's a lot of other things, such as going into World War I, there's applications of Jominian and Clausewitzian thinking that are done in various ways by the military, different interpretations, differences that are best articulated. And I do this throughout the whole book. The readers that check this book out, I introduce at the beginning 2 essential philosophical terms. And these are, considered big words or fancy words, but they are unavoidable words because there are no simpler words. I try to use them sparingly, but these words appear hundreds, if not thousands of times in the book. And the first one is ontology. When we say ontology, it means that which we believe is or is not real. What I mean by that, there's an important distinction here. It's not is or isn't, because I can say, hey, I'm holding my book now. I can say, I'm physically holding this heavy book here, right? And the physics, the biology, the tacit understanding of my senses, that's one thing. The acknowledging this is a book, that's kind of a higher level of abstraction. That's where ontology really resides, which is we collectively all share through our culture, our language, and then our paradigms, our social paradigms, a very elaborate, reinforcing, but also changing belief system on what is and is not real. And these are things that eventually end in things we can pick up and feel the weight of, right? The second word that I use throughout the whole book that's also extremely important, and there is no other word, is epistemology. It's another philosophical term, and this is looking at the study of knowledge or how we know how we know. And there's an element of like meta there, right? This is a little abstract, but the reason that this is important is that when military say things like, there are centers of gravity, or there are levels of war, or there are steps in a military decision-making methodology, and here's how they work. Or there are principles, external, objective principles of war that are enduring, right? All those statements, those declarations are epistemological, because I've been in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times, but if you had asked me to go and walk on the map somewhere, if I had free range of motion, and find where the tactical and operational levels of war separated, right? You can't do that, right? And that's just one example of many. Epistemology means that you can't actually touch the construct that we are sharing collectively. However, these things are maintained and nourished and passed on to the next generation. It's how we do everything. It's how we share collective knowledge and we pass it on to the next generation. Much of it is either ontological or epistemological. And they're distinct because they govern what the structure is of your war paradigm and how you approach warfare. And the differences between how we, mostly in the West, have maintained, I argue, the functionalist paradigm versus how another opponent may use radical structuralism or radical humanism. And then there's a growing movement that's interpretivist, right? And this is where I correlate much of the military design movement as well as other actors. This is what differentiates us at the philosophical level. You have to address ontology and epistemology, which means you have to say, take Jomini and Clausewitz and say, okay, they're arguing about the same stuff in similar pathways, but there are clear differences between what Jomini said and what Clausewitz said. And what are those differences? Ontologically and epistemologically. That's where the book gets a little heavy. But I think I creep readers in carefully, and then there's lots and lots of examples and citations to kind of help them along.
There's a lot in that, right? And I'm thinking, you mentioned the target audience, and of course there definitely is an audience for this, and a very important audience. And I'm thinking about the next generation of strategists, of military practitioners, and so on. And if you could, and I'm sure you do some mentoring and coaching, but just if you could humor us, and if you speak to a young strategist, what are some of the things that you look to advise them?
Wow, that's a tall order question. Thank you, Tony. And I talk about this in my introduction, because you have to justify, why do we even need to reconceptualize war? How arrogant are you, military philosopher guy, to try to, do this? Isn't our current conceptualization of war appropriate? And what I would offer to the new and the next generation of military leaders, political leaders, academics, professionals, all the people that are involved in looking at security affairs and foreign policy, is that the history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And we can look to Kuhnian scientific paradigm shifts as wonderful examples of where the institution was kicking and screaming as it was dragged away from a previous scientific paradigm that it knew was right. And a lot of those people that are advocates of the outdated paradigm, Kuhn says they just die or they retire. And that's a variation. Kuhn wrote this after Max Planck, but Planck, famous physicist, was talking about the same thing. And his statement, I use it, it's paraphrased. I actually have his actual longer articulation of this, but the paraphrase is physics advances one funeral at a time. And what he meant in the actual articulation of it is that there are those that take the current frame and will not change ontologically or epistemologically because that's their worldview and that's it. And until they retire or die, they're going to dominate and be the institutional defenders, and they will attack and prevent entry of any new ideas that threaten or underpin any of the ontological or epistemological assertions that relish and maintain and sustain that existing paradigm, right? So this is where we have a little bit of the Kuhnian scientific paradigm evidence, but social paradigms don't replace a outdated one with a superior one. Social paradigms, as Burrell and Morgan say, they're just in flux with each other. They're competing for dominance. And certainly, if you have enough conflict and one social paradigm wins out, there's certainly the opportunity, or theoretically, you could have a world that's unified by one dominant paradigm. But even then, as long as you have curious and creative human beings that are continuously challenging, the other paradigms are always have an opportunity to come back or get pulled up by their own bootstraps. The challenge, I think, for the next generation is, do they accept everything that their forefathers or the current generation tells them? And I think the answer there is no. At the same time, we don't want to throw a baby out with bathwater, and crossing your arms and saying not true without really knowing doctrine, theory, current systems, that also is equally disruptive and inappropriate. The best window, I think, is taking everything that we currently are doing with a critical and creative eye and having that curiosity to innovate, improvise, to experiment, to reflect, or to be a reflective practitioner, to do things while thinking about what you're doing as you're going, and having the curiosity and the risk mitigation to challenge even the most deeply held institutional beliefs, because sometimes those are the very things that are going to drag us into a horrific war that could threaten our species' survival. And we certainly have more of that today than even 100 years ago.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, will conclude the first part of Tony and Ben talking about his book, Reconceptualizing War. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and the second part will be available next week. See you then. Bye-bye.